Welcome back, class. Let's continue our conversation on Chapter 6, Sensation and Perception. So we've looked at sensation when it comes to sensory data for the visual system. We know that now we've tracked it through the environment, through our eyeballs, through the optic nerve, through the thalamus, all the way to the occipital lobe where it gets processed. Now we're there. Now let's look at how we organize this perceptual information. First idea we want to offer is Gestalt, an organized whole. Gestalt psychologists propose principles used to organize sensations into meaningful wholes. In perception, and Gestalt in perception, the whole may exceed the sum of its parts. We filter incoming information and construct perceptions. Now, this whole idea of the whole exceeding the sum of its parts, think of it this way. 2 plus 2 equals 4. But in Gestalt psychology and Gestalt perspective here, 2 plus 2 equals 5 or 6. In this case, the whole, the end result, is going to be greater than the things that make it up. That's the basic premise behind Gestalt. So let's look at an example. Form perception. How do we organize and interpret the shapes and colors into meaningful perceptions? People tend to organize pieces of information into an organized whole or a gestalt. So what we're looking at here is a Necker cube. What do you see? Circles with white lines or a cube? If you stare at the cube, you may notice that it reverses location, moving the tiny X in the center from the right edge to the back. At times, the cube may seem to float forward with circles behind it. At other times, the circles may become holes through which the cube appears, as though it were floating behind them. So there is far more to perception than meets the eye. So what we see is greater than what is actually there. So we're perceiving something that's more than what we see in front of us, more than the sensory data. That is the whole idea of Gestalt. Other form perception, some of these things you probably have seen as well before. We have figure ground. The organization of the visual field into objects, the figures, that stand out from their surroundings, the ground. Now, when we look at this object, because the figure ground is somewhat debatable here, we see possibly two things. We either see a vase or chalice, or we look at two faces staring at each other. Figure ground. We also feel figure ground too when you find yourself in certain situations. First, the figure is the thing that we tend to focus on, and the ground is the thing in the background. Now, you may experience this figure ground scenario when you're at a stoplight at an intersection. So you're parked at a stoplight, or you stopped at a stoplight at an intersection, and there's a big truck next to you. What happens when that truck that's next to you moves? Okay, you feel like you're moving. That is sort of like a little bit of an illusion occurs because you're so focused on you, the figure, that gives you that illusion that you're the one actually moving. So that gives you a little bit of a real life example of some of the ways in which figure ground can sort of reveal itself in your day-to-day life. Now, when it comes to form perception, Gestalt has ideas dealing with grouping as well. Grouping is the perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into coherent groups. So we have proximity, grouping nearby figures together. So if they're close together, we see them as a group. Continuity, perceiving smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. We like smooth and continuous as opposed to things broken up. And then closure, filling in gaps to create a complete whole object. We close things in our mind so they become complete and whole. We don't like gaps. So here are a couple of examples. In A, we see the proximity. We see those lines as being put in two lines, and two lines. We automatically group them that way. And then example of continuity. We see this smooth arcing line like a snake going up and down, up and down. We automatically will see that as one unified line because we want to make sure that it has continuity. And then the last one is closure. We automatically put something there so that we can close it up. We don't want to have broken things sort of like in front of us. Therefore, you all are perceiving triangles. You are perceiving triangles in item C, but there are no triangles. Okay, so we fill in gaps to create a complete whole object. Thus, we assume that the circles on the left are complete but partially blocked by the triangle. Adding nothing more than a little line segments to close off the circles prompts your brain to construct a triangle. That's all that's going on. So our brain does this stuff without us. All right. So Gestalt is showing how it is that we process and organize this information that comes into us. So another aspect of vision is going to be not simply how we organize from a Gestalt perspective, but also depth perception. Depth perception is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, although the images that strike the retina are actually 2-dimensional. Depth perception allows us to judge distance and is present at least in part at birth in humans and other animals. So it's partially available to us when we're born, but it becomes fully online when certain things happen. So we can test of early 3D perception, okay, using the following visual cliff. Most infants refuse to crawl across the visual cliff. So we have this thing that appears to be really high, and there's a drop down there, the cliff, so to speak, but it's covered with a sort of a transparent glass, so they could walk over it without crawl over it without harming themselves. But what will happen is if the baby is old enough, it will stop before it falls over the cliff. So crawling, no matter when it begins, seems to increase an infant's fear of heights. All right. So the notion here is Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk devised this miniature cliff with a glass-covered drop-off to determine whether crawling infants and newborn animals can perceive depth. Even when coaxed, infants are reluctant to venture onto the glass over the cliff. And of course, obviously, that has a major survivability function to it. It helps us in our survival to not do something that could endanger us. So as we learn to crawl, the fear of heights and the more able to recognize the fall is something that becomes more prominent in us, so we'll avoid these particular scenarios and not injure ourselves. So when it comes to depth perception, we have binocular cues, which require 2 eyes to help with the perception of depth, but we also have other types of things as well that we'll talk about in a second. So with binocular cues, we have retinal disparity. Binocular cue for perceiving depth. By comparing images from the 2 retinas and the 2 eyes, the brain calculates distance. It's able to get this sense and feel of 3 dimensions, that something has depth. So if you hold your hand out in front of you and display one of your fingers and you close one eye and then close the other eye, you'll see that image shift a little bit. That shift is retinal disparity. Your retinas are at different locations, so you have a slightly different picture of the item off in the distance, and that helps for you to determine depth as well as get a sense of 3 dimensions. And it's the same basic idea that 3D filmmakers use too for when you're watching a 3D film or 3D TV show. But there are monocular cues for depth as well. So binocular cues require 2 eyes in order to judge distance. But monocular cues exist as well to give us a sense of distance. Depth cues such as interposition or linear perspective available to either eye alone. We have relative height, relative size, interposition, linear perspective, and all these types of things give us this sense of distance. So let's look at some of these a little bit more closely. So interposition. When one object appears to block the view of another, we assume that the blocking object is in the position between our eyes and the blocked object. So the thing that we see more clearly is in front of the things which is being blocked by the thing we see more clearly. Relative size. We intuitively know to interpret familiar objects of known size as further away when they appear smaller. So if we look at the photograph on the right of the flowers, we see some big flowers there right in front of us. Okay, we're familiar with flowers, and we see some off in the distance. So we know that the smaller flowers that we see on our retina are further away, and the ones that are really big on our retina, they're simply closer. They're not gigantic flowers, they're just closer to us. The cartoon also displays the same basic idea. Let me read it real quickly. I have no depth perception, the person's saying. Is there a cop standing on the corner, or do you have a tiny person in your hair? So there's a uniformed police officer, obviously off in the distance on the corner of the street next to the mailbox, and because they're so far away, they appear rather small on one's retina. All right, we're familiar with people, familiar with officers, and they don't usually come in very miniature sizes, so we understand that this means he's further away. There's depth there. Monocular cues can give us that type of information. So here's linear perspective. The flowers in the distance seem further away because the rows converge. Our brain reads this as a sign of distance. And you know this from when you were a really young kid going to school and you want to draw a road off into the distance. You'd have two lines and they just get closer to the top of the page, and that gave you this sense of distance. So these two red lines meet the retina as being the same size. However, our perception of distance affects our perception of length, and therefore we see this. Okay, so again, we see things, okay, we perceive them, but they don't always demonstrate reality to us sometimes. So the notion is that we are processing this information, we're trying to make sense of it, but there are certain things that we're sort of programmed to see certain ways, and one of them is this idea of linear perspective, and when they converge, we see distance. We also have monocular cues when it comes to relative motion. When we are moving, we can tell which objects are further away because it takes longer to pass them. So a picture of a moon on a sign would zip behind us, but the actual moon is too far for us to pass. So the idea is that the moon stays put, all right, but some sign of the moon on the side of the road will zip past us. So that was closer to us. The moon is further away. Same idea too if you have a jet flying in the sky off of the distance. It seems to move slower across the thing because of relative motion. Now we have this idea of perceptual constancy. Objects are perceived as unchanging, having consistent color, brightness, shape, and size, even as illumination and retinal images change. So the idea for us to understand what's going on around us in the world, we have to have certain things sort of like set in stone, so to speak. And one of them is this idea of perceptual constancy. Color and brightness constancy as well. Color constancy, perceiving familiar objects as having consistent color even if changing illumination alters the wavelength reflected by the objects. Brightness constancy, similar, depends on the context. So the idea is that we understand that the environment situation may change so that something may appear to change color or size or brightness, but we maintain this perceptual constancy in order for us to be able to deal with the world in a very sane and logical manner. So shape and size constancy. Shape constancy, perceiving the form of familiar objects as constant even when our retinas receive changing images of them, perceiving size constancy, perceiving constancy as having constant size, even when the distance from them varies. For example, you're playing on the beach, and there's a beach ball, and the beach ball is huge, and you hit the ball, and then as the beach ball is being bandied about by other people on the beach, when it gets further away from you, it appears really, really small on your retina, but you know it's still the same size. Same basic idea when it comes to shape constancy. You look at the doors here in the image that we have here on the screen. The closed door, the door that's open a little bit, and the door that's open much wider are all still a door, even though the shape of it changes. We maintain that sense of constancy. Now, experience in visual perception. A couple of ideas here. When people are born, for example, and don't have sight, and they later may acquire sight or some version of sight, there are certain things that they may have difficulty doing. So restored vision and sensory restriction. The effects of sensory restriction on infant cats, monkeys, and humans suggest there is a critical period for normal sensory and perceptual development. Without stimulation, normal connections do not develop. So being blind between ages 3 and 46 cost Mike his ability to learn individual faces. So people have grown up without vision, but then have it surgically gained sight in adulthood. They learn to interpret depth, motion, figure ground distinctions, but could not differentiate shapes or even faces because they may have missed out during a critical time of their development, and they no longer will have the ability to have those types of capability. But we do see that there is perceptual adaptation, the ability to adjust to an artificially displaced or even inverted visual field. So here you have somebody who has goggles that flip their visual images, and so as you can see, the person is trying to shake this guy's hand, but it's way high because the guy is almost like standing upside down to the person who has those special goggles on. But we tend to adapt to this stuff rather easily. There was a video that demonstrated a quarterback wears these goggles that flips the world so the people appear in the sky, so to speak, upside down. And he's throwing the football. After a few failed attempts, he adjusts and adapts, and he's able to pass the football in the air without too much difficulty, because we can adapt to those scenarios from time to time.